The captain's voice was calm but final, "We're going down. 8 seconds to impact." 156 passengers braced for death as the aircraft plunged toward water. Then a small girl unbuckled her seatbelt and ran toward the cockpit, speaking words no child should know. Her deceased father had spent 3 years teaching her impossible procedures in secret. Now she had seconds to attempt what trained pilots couldn't do, land a dying aircraft with her hands barely reaching the controls, proving that a parent's love can save lives years after death. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 shudders violently at 12,000 feet, and Captain Michael Chen feels the control column go soft in his hands. That sickening looseness, that means hydraulic failure, that means the aircraft is no longer an extension of his will but a machine deciding its own fate. His co-pilot Sarah Martinez is already running through emergency checklists with mechanical precision, her voice steady despite what both of them know. They're 23 miles from San Francisco International, descending through coastal fog, and the aircraft just stopped listening to them in any meaningful way. Hydraulic pressure dropping across all 3 systems, Sarah says, and there's no panic in her voice because panic would be unprofessional, would be a waste of the precious seconds they have left to try anything that might work. Backup systems unresponsive. Flight controls degraded to minimal authority. Michael keys the intercom, keeping his voice level even as his mind races through every emergency procedure he learned in 22 years of flying. Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for emergency landing. Brace positions in 3 minutes. 3 minutes is generous. 3 minutes assumes they maintain some degree of control during descent. 3 minutes assumes the landing gear deploys when they need it. The aircraft lurches again, dropping 200 feet in seconds, and Michael feels sweat running down his back despite the cool cockpit air. He's been through simulator training for hydraulic failures, practiced emergency procedures until they became muscle memory, but simulators don't capture the visceral terror of feeling a 100-ton aircraft stop responding to your inputs while 156 souls depend on you to bring them safely to Earth. The worst part isn't the fear, pilots train to manage fear, it's the helplessness, the understanding that expertise and experience mean nothing when the laws of physics override human skill. He thinks about his wife waiting at home, about telling her he tried everything, about whether she'll understand that sometimes trying everything isn't enough. In seat 23C, 11-year-old Maya Rodriguez hears the captain's announcement and feels something shift inside her chest, not fear exactly, but recognition. She knows that careful steadiness in his voice. She heard it in her father's voice during their training sessions, when he'd simulate emergencies on the flight simulator he built in their garage and say, "Stay calm, think through the problem, find the solution nobody taught you to find." Her father had been a test pilot for the Air Force, developing emergency procedures for scenarios commercial pilots never encountered, and he'd taught her everything before the experimental aircraft he was testing suffered structural failure at 40,000 feet 3 years ago. Other passengers around her are beginning to panic. The woman in 23B is crying silently, clutching a photograph of 2 young children, her sons, Maya guesses, children who might lose their mother today. The businessman in 23A has his eyes closed, lips moving in prayer, his knuckles white where he grips the armrests. Behind her, a young couple holds hands across the aisle, and Maya hears the man whisper, "I love you, I'm so sorry we didn't have more time." A flight attendant moves down the aisle with grim efficiency, checking seatbelts, demonstrating brace positions, her professional mask barely hiding the fear underneath. Maya watches how the flight attendant's hands shake slightly as she adjusts an oxygen mask, how she pauses for just a moment to close her eyes and take a deep breath before moving to the next row. Nobody looks at Maya and sees anything except a child, a small girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing a hoodie and jeans, young enough that the flight attendants checked on her twice during the flight to make sure she was comfortable, young enough that adults automatically speak to her in simplified language and assume she needs protection. Nobody knows that she spent 3 years, from age 7 to 10, learning aircraft systems from someone who understood aviation at a level most pilots never reach. Nobody knows that her father taught her not just the procedures in the manual but the procedures that work when the manual fails, when conventional training runs out and you need to understand the physics of flight itself, the relationship between control surfaces and airspeed and descent rate that lets you do things that shouldn't be possible. The aircraft drops suddenly, and passengers scream. Maya feels the sickening lurch of uncontrolled descent and knows with absolute certainty what it means: the pilots have lost authority over the flight path. She calculates descent rate in her head from the pressure change in her ears, roughly 1800 feet per minute, too fast for a normal approach, sustainable for maybe another 4 minutes before they're too low and too fast to recover. She closes her eyes and sees her father's garage simulator, hears his voice explaining, when hydraulics fail completely, you have maybe 2 minutes before physics takes over completely. The key is using what little authority remains before it's gone entirely. She remembers being 9 years old, failing a simulated zero hydraulic landing 15 times in a row, crying in frustration, and her father kneeling beside her chair saying gently, "Maya, failure in simulation is how we survive reality. Every mistake here is a life saved later. Try again." She had tried again. And again, until she could do it perfectly every single time, until the procedures became instinct deeper than thought. In the cockpit, Michael and Sarah are discovering that their training has run out. Every emergency procedure they attempt produces minimal results or no results at all. The landing gear won't deploy, hydraulic pressure too low. The flaps respond sluggishly, barely extending to 10 degrees when they need 30. The spoilers that normally help control descent rate are frozen in place. The aircraft is descending toward San Francisco Bay with the inevitability of a stone falling through water, and they have perhaps 90 seconds before they're low enough that recovery becomes impossible. Tower, United 4792, we are declaring an emergency, Sarah transmits, her voice finally showing strain. Multiple hydraulic failures, minimal flight control authority, unable to maintain controlled descent. We're going to attempt a landing but we need every emergency vehicle you have. The tower controller's response crackles through their headsets with forced calm. United 4792, emergency services are rolling. Winds light and variable, you're cleared for any runway, any approach. Any approach means they're already beyond standard procedures. Any approach means the controller knows they're just trying to put the aircraft somewhere that isn't water or buildings, that survival rather than procedure is now the only objective. Michael glances at the altimeter, 6,000 feet, still dropping fast. He does the math and feels ice in his stomach. At their current descent rate and distance from the airport, they won't make the runway. They won't even make land. They're going into the bay. Sarah, he says quietly, and she hears everything in how he says her name. She looks at the instruments and sees what he sees, descent rate increasing as they lose what little control authority they had, altitude dropping too fast, the simple physics that means they have perhaps 60 seconds before they're at impact altitude with no ability to prevent it. Sarah keys the cabin intercom with shaking hands. Flight attendants, we are 30 seconds from impact. Secure yourselves immediately. Her voice cracks on the last word, and Michael reaches over to squeeze her shoulder, a gesture of solidarity between two people who are about to fail at the most important responsibility they've ever held. Maya unbuckles her seatbelt. The flight attendant near her row immediately notices and hurries over, concern on her face. "Honey, you need to stay seated and buckled. We're going to be landing soon and I need you to be safe." "I need to talk to the pilots," Maya says, and her voice is calm and clear and so certain that the flight attendant pauses, confused by the contrast between this small girl and the absolute conviction in her words. "Sweetheart, the pilots are very busy right now. I need you to sit down and..." "They've lost hydraulic authority across all 3 systems," Maya says, and now the flight attendant is staring at her because those aren't words an 11-year-old should know. "The descent rate is too high and they're not going to make the runway. They have maybe a minute before impact altitude and they're going to try everything in their emergency procedures but none of it will work because those procedures assume you have at least partial control authority." The flight attendant, her name tag says, "Rachel," Stares at Maya with growing confusion and something approaching hope. How do you know these things? Do you understand aviation? My father was a test pilot. He taught me emergency procedures for scenarios like this. Procedures that don't exist in commercial pilot training. Procedures for when everything else has failed. Maya's voice is steady but urgent. I know how to land an aircraft with zero hydraulics. I've done it 300 times on a simulator. Please, you have to let me try. The flight attendant's professional training wars with what she's hearing. This is a child. Children don't understand aviation emergencies. But this child just used technical language with precision that suggests genuine knowledge, and the aircraft is definitely descending too fast, and she can hear the strain in the captain's announcements, and the captain's voice comes through the intercom again, and this time there's no hiding the reality. This is Captain Chen. I need everyone in brace positions immediately. Flight attendants, secure the cabin now. We are going to have a hard impact. I repeat, we are going to have a hard impact. This is not a drill. Around Maya, passengers begin to scream. Some pray. Some call loved ones, crying into phones as they say final goodbyes. Some just sit in frozen terror, understanding in those careful words that they're about to crash, that the pilot just told them they're going to die or be severely injured and there's nothing anyone can do. A man across the aisle is holding his wife, both of them crying. A teenage girl is calling her mother, sobbing, I love you, Mom, I love you so much. An elderly man sits with perfect stillness, eyes closed, accepting what's coming with the quiet dignity of someone who has lived a full life. A young mother holds her infant son against her chest, whispering promises she knows she might not be able to keep. The flight attendants move through the cabin with mechanical efficiency, getting everyone into brace positions, securing loose items, preparing for impact with the grim knowledge that most of these people won't survive what's coming. Jennifer, the lead flight attendant, has tears streaming down her face even as she maintains her professional composure, even as she helps passenger after passenger prepare for the crash she's certain will kill them all. Maya stands up, and now the flight attendant tries to grab her arm. Honey, please, you need to. My father was Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez, Air Force test pilot, Maya says, and she's moving toward the front of the aircraft now, squeezing past passengers in brace positions. He developed emergency procedures for unrecoverable flight scenarios. He taught me differential control surface management for zero hydraulic scenarios. I know how to land this aircraft. The words sound insane coming from an 11-year-old. The flight attendant should stop her, should force her back to her seat, should protect this child from whatever delusion she's experiencing in her terror. But there's something in Maya's eyes, a calm certainty, a technical precision in how she speaks, and the terrible awareness that conventional procedures have failed and the pilots just announced they're about to crash. The lead flight attendant, Jennifer, sees Maya approaching and moves to intercept her. Young lady, you need to return to your seat immediately. We're about to. 45 seconds, Maya says, looking directly at Jennifer with eyes that seem far older than 11. That's how long they have before impact altitude. Maybe less. They're going to try split throttle management and asymmetric thrust to control descent, but it won't work because the problem isn't thrust, it's that they can't translate thrust into controlled flight path without hydraulic authority. I can do a differential control surface dead stick landing using manual tab trim and throttle-only pitch control. My father taught me on 18 different aircraft configurations. Let me try or everyone dies. Jennifer stares at this small girl speaking with technical precision that sounds like it came from someone with decades of experience. Her training says protect passengers, maintain order, never let unauthorized persons into the cockpit. Her instinct says this child might be insane, might be traumatized, might be inventing knowledge she doesn't have. But the captain just announced hard impact, and Jennifer has been flying for 14 years and she knows what those words mean. They mean the pilots can't save them, they mean everyone in this cabin has perhaps a minute to live. She thinks about protocol, about liability, about all the reasons she should refuse this impossible request. Then she thinks about her 6-year-old daughter waiting at home for mommy to come back from her trip, and she makes a choice that has nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with a desperate mother's hope that maybe, impossibly, this child is telling the truth. She makes a decision that violates every protocol she knows. She pulls out her emergency access key and runs for the cockpit door, Maya right behind her. Rachel, the other flight attendant, watches them go with wide eyes, understanding that something extraordinary is happening, that normal procedures have been abandoned in favor of desperate hope. In the cockpit, Michael and Sarah are experiencing the worst 30 seconds of their careers. They've tried everything: differential thrust, manual trim, sacrificing airspeed for descent control, and nothing is working. The aircraft continues its too-fast descent toward San Francisco Bay, the water visible below them through breaks in the fog, the altimeter spinning down past 3,000 feet. They have perhaps 20 seconds before they're below 500 feet and any recovery becomes impossible. Michael's mind races through every scenario, every training session, every emergency procedure he's memorized over 2 decades of flying. He thinks about United 232 in Sioux City, the DC-10 that crashed with total hydraulic failure but still saved most passengers through heroic piloting. He thinks about every success story, every miraculous recovery, searching desperately for something, anything that might work. But those pilots had more altitude, more time, more options. He and Sarah have seconds, and physics is unforgiving. Split throttle again, Michael says desperately, and Sarah adjusts the throttles asymmetrically, trying to translate engine power into some kind of directional control, but the aircraft barely responds. The physics are simple and brutal: without hydraulic pressure to move control surfaces, without flaps to generate lift, without landing gear to absorb impact, they're just a metal tube falling at 2,000 feet per minute toward water that will break their bodies with the force of concrete. 15 seconds to minimum recovery altitude, Sarah says, and her voice finally breaks because she's 29 years old and she's going to die in 15 seconds and she can't stop it. She thinks about her fiancé waiting for her at home, about the wedding they're planning for next summer, about all the years she won't have, all because she couldn't figure out how to save this aircraft. The cockpit door chimes, the emergency access code. Both pilots ignore it because nothing outside that door matters when you have 15 seconds before impact becomes inevitable. The door opens anyway, and Jennifer appears with an 11-year-old girl, and Michael's first response is anger because they're about to crash and someone brought a child to watch it happen. "Captain, she says she can land the aircraft," Jennifer says, and the words are so absurd that for a moment Michael can't process them. Tab trim 15 degrees nose up, throttle management for pitch control, accept skid landing with 50-knot ground speed, use differential thrust for lateral control during flare, Maya says rapidly, stepping into the cockpit with absolute confidence, her eyes scanning the instrument panel with recognition that shocks Michael because she's reading the instruments like someone who understands them. "My father was James Rodriguez, Air Force test pilot. He taught me dead-stick landing procedures for zero hydraulic scenarios. You've got 8 seconds before you're below minimum recovery altitude and I've done this 300 times on a simulator." "That's impossible," Sarah says, but she's staring at this child who just used language that suggests genuine technical knowledge, and they have 8 seconds, and conventional procedures have failed. "Throttles will control pitch," Maya says, moving toward the pilot's seat with purpose. "Manual tab trim provides minimal control surface authority. Accept hard landing but control the descent rate enough for structural survival. This is what my father trained me for. Let me try or everyone dies right now." Michael looks at the altimeter, 2,000 feet, still dropping. He looks at this 11-year-old girl who speaks with the precision of someone who understands aircraft systems. He looks at Sarah, sees his own desperation reflected in her eyes. They have 6 seconds. Maybe less. Every procedure they know has failed. What does he have to lose by letting a child try something impossible? He slides out of the pilot's seat. Maya climbs into a chair designed for adults, her small body barely reaching the controls, her feet unable to touch the rudder pedals. She grabs the control column with hands that seem impossibly small for this responsibility, looks at the altimeter showing 1,500 feet, calculates descent rate and distance and time in her head the way her father taught her, accessing 3 years of training for exactly this impossible moment. She can almost hear his voice, "Maya, when you're out of time and out of options, remember, physics doesn't care about fear. It only cares about what you do with the tools you have left." 5 seconds, Sarah says, her voice hollow. Maya's right hand moves to the manual trim wheel, a backup system most pilots barely use, a way to mechanically adjust control surfaces when hydraulics fail. She spins it with practiced precision, feeling through the control column as the trim tabs move, creating tiny changes in airflow over the elevator that wouldn't be enough for normal flight but might be enough for what she needs. Her father made her practice this exact motion thousands of times. Feel the resistance, Maya. The trim wheel tells you what the aircraft is doing. Listen to it. 4 seconds, Sarah says. Maya's left hand grabs the throttle levers, pushing the left throttle forward, pulling the right one back, creating asymmetric thrust that normally would only help with directional control but in zero hydraulic scenarios becomes your only tool for managing the aircraft's attitude. She's not flying the aircraft the way pilots are trained to fly, she's fighting with physics itself, using every tiny bit of available authority to influence descent rate. The engines respond with a roar, and she feels the aircraft begin to yaw slightly, the asymmetric thrust creating forces she can use. 3 seconds, Sarah whispers. The descent rate decreases fractionally, not much, maybe 200 feet per minute, but at 900 feet of altitude that 200 feet per minute represents 5 more seconds of life, 5 more seconds to influence the flight path. Maya adjusts throttles with movements so precise they seem mechanical, advances trim another 5 degrees, watches the vertical speed indicator respond with agonizing slowness. She's doing exactly what her father taught her, small inputs, Maya. In zero hydraulic conditions, aggressive inputs just waste the little authority you have. Smooth, precise, patient. 2 seconds, and Sarah isn't calling the countdown anymore, she's just watching this 11-year-old girl manipulating controls with muscle memory that suggests hundreds of hours of practice, and the vertical speed indicator is still showing 1,200 feet per minute of descent but it was 1,600 just 2 seconds ago and that difference might be the difference between death and survival. Maya pulls both throttles to flight idle, then immediately advances the left one again, a technique her father called throttle pulse pitch management, using the engine's response lag to create momentary changes in pitch attitude. The aircraft's nose comes up slightly, not much, maybe 2 degrees, but 2 degrees of pitch change at 600 feet of altitude with 500 feet per minute less descent rate means the difference between catastrophic impact and survivable crash. 1 second, Sarah says, but they're at 400 feet now and still descending at 800 feet per minute, which is still too fast, still hard enough to kill people, but Maya spins the trim wheel hard right, creating a sideslip that bleeds energy, that trades forward speed for descent control, and her father's voice is in her head saying, sometimes you can't prevent impact, you can only shape how it happens. The water is directly below them, gray and hostile through the cockpit windows. Maya can see individual whitecaps, can see the texture of the surface that's about to shatter their aircraft. 50 feet. Maya advances both throttles to full power even though convention says you should never increase power in an imminent crash because it might make impact worse, but her father taught her that the second or two of additional thrust before impact can provide just enough pitch authority to change the impact angle from catastrophic to survivable. 25 feet. The engine thrust catches, the nose comes up fractionally, and Maya uses that momentary authority to adjust the aircraft's pitch to almost level, accepting that they're going to hit but controlling how they hit. She's thinking in fractions of degrees now, in tiny adjustments that might reduce impact forces by percentages that determine who lives and who dies. 10 feet. She pulls the throttles to idle, letting the engine stop fighting gravity, letting physics take the aircraft down in what's almost a controlled descent except it's still too fast, still violent, still going to hurt. Michael is gripping the back of her seat, Sarah has her hands over her face, and Maya is completely calm in the center of catastrophe, doing what her father trained her to do. The aircraft hits the water. The impact is brutal, a shattering crash that throws Sarah against her harness, that tears metal and breaks windows and floods the forward cabin with water, that creates forces no human body was designed to withstand. The noise is apocalyptic, a thunderous boom followed by the screech of tearing aluminum and the roar of water flooding through breaches in the fuselage. But the fuselage holds. The wings don't tear off. The aircraft doesn't cartwheel or break in half or sink immediately. It crashes hard into San Francisco Bay but stays mostly intact, skidding across the surface in a spray of foam and debris before finally coming to rest, tilted but floating, battered but survivable. In the cabin, passengers are screaming and crying and some are injured from the impact, but they're alive. The emergency exit doors blow open and slides deploy automatically, and people begin evacuating into the cold bay water where rescue boats are already approaching, their sirens wailing across the water. The flight attendants move through the chaos with grim efficiency, helping injured passengers, directing evacuation, doing the jobs they trained for. Rachel is crying as she helps an elderly man into a life vest. Jennifer is shouting instructions while blood runs down her face from a cut on her forehead, but they're all professional, all focused, all doing what needs to be done. In the cockpit, Sarah is crying and staring at Maya with something like awe. You just landed an aircraft. You're 11 years old and you just landed an aircraft in zero hydraulic conditions. How did you? Who taught you? Maya's hands are shaking now that it's over, trembling so badly she has to grip the control column to steady them. My father. Lieutenant Colonel James Rodriguez. He said someday I might need to save lives using what he taught me. I didn't believe him. I thought we were just playing on his simulator. But he was teaching me emergency procedures that don't exist in any manual, preparing me for the day when someone would need those procedures to survive. Michael climbs back into the cockpit, water up to his knees from the bay flooding in through damaged fuselage sections. He looks at Maya with an expression that combines gratitude and shock and something like disbelief. You saved 156 lives. A minute ago we were about to crash and kill everyone, and you saved us. An 11-year-old girl saved us. His voice breaks on the last word, and he starts crying, great racking sobs of relief and gratitude and the release of impossible tension. Emergency responders are boarding the aircraft now through the exits, helping evacuate passengers, triaging injuries. Maya sits in the pilot's seat that's too big for her, watching people climb out onto the wings and into rescue boats, watching everyone survive something they shouldn't have survived. Her hands won't stop shaking. She can hear her father's voice in her memory, explaining differential thrust management, demonstrating manual trim techniques, making her practice scenarios exactly like this one until she could perform the procedures without thinking. He taught her these skills because he loved her. Because he was a test pilot who knew aviation could kill you in 1,000 ways and wanted his daughter to understand how to fight back against those deaths. Because he was preparing emergency procedures for scenarios most pilots never encounter and he wanted someone to learn them, someone to carry forward his work if he died. She was 7 years old when the training started. She thought it was just time with her father, just games on a simulator, just learning something interesting. She didn't understand he was giving her capabilities that might someday save lives. 3 years ago, his experimental aircraft suffered structural failure at 40,000 feet. He ejected too late. The investigation report said structural testing procedures were inadequate, that the aircraft failed because of design flaws nobody predicted. Maya read the report when she was 10 years old, understanding the technical language, understanding that her father died advancing aviation safety, developing procedures that might prevent future deaths. She never imagined that those procedures would save 156 people on a commercial flight when she was 11 years old. The Coast Guard pulls her out of the aircraft with the other passengers, wrapping her in a thermal blanket, checking her for injuries. She's physically fine, no broken bones, no serious trauma, just the minor cuts and bruises that everyone has. But she's not fine. She's 11 years old and she just landed a crashing aircraft, accepted responsibility that adults couldn't manage, made split-second decisions that determined whether people lived or died. Her hands won't stop shaking and her breathing won't slow down and she can't stop thinking about what would have happened if she'd made different choices, if she'd been slightly slower or less precise or less trained. On the shore, reporters are already gathering. Emergency vehicles line the waterfront. Passengers are being loaded into ambulances, most with minor injuries, some with serious trauma, but all alive because an 11-year-old girl learned emergency procedures from her deceased father and used them when conventional training failed. The NTSB investigators arrive within hours. They interview survivors, examine the aircraft, analyze flight data. When they interview Maya, asking how she knew what to do, she tells them about her father's training, and they don't believe her until they visit her mother's house and find Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez's files, 3 filing cabinets full of emergency procedure development, training manuals for scenarios that don't exist in commercial aviation, detailed simulation logs showing hundreds of hours of practice on situations exactly like what happened on United 4792. He was developing these procedures for the Air Force, the lead investigator says, reading through files that detail zero hydraulic landing techniques, differential thrust management, manual trim control strategies, advanced emergency protocols for test pilot scenarios. And he taught them to his daughter. He taught a child procedures that exceed what most pilots ever learn. The investigator finds training logs documenting Maya's practice sessions, Saturday mornings from 8 a.m. to noon, Sunday afternoons from 2 p.m. to 6 p.m., every weekend for 3 years. Scenario descriptions: complete hydraulic failure at 5,000 feet, asymmetric thrust recovery, zero-flap water landing. Each scenario practiced until Maya could execute it perfectly. The dedication is staggering, a father spending hundreds of hours teaching his daughter skills that seemed unnecessary until they became essential. Maya's mother, Carmen, sits with her daughter in a hospital room where they're keeping Maya for observation. Carmen is crying and holding Maya's hand and trying to process that her daughter just did something impossible, that James's dedication to teaching Maya aviation procedures created capabilities that saved 156 lives 3 years after his death. He used to say that knowledge is love made permanent, Carmen says quietly. That teaching you was how he made sure his love for you would last forever, even if something happened to him. I thought he was just being sentimental. I didn't realize he was preparing you for this. Maya leans against her mother, feeling the weight of what she did settling over her like physical pressure. I was so scared. When I realized they were going to crash, that conventional procedures had failed, that I might be the only person who knew how to prevent it, I've never been that scared in my life. But I could hear Dad's voice in my head, telling me what to do, guiding me through each step. It was like he was there with me in the cockpit. The other passengers want to thank her. They send cards and messages and some visit her in the hospital, and they all say variations of the same thing: you saved my life, you're a hero, what you did was impossible but you did it anyway. Maya accepts their gratitude with quiet grace, but inside she's struggling with complicated emotions she can't entirely name. Pride, yes, and relief that everyone survived. But also grief that her father isn't here to see how well his training worked. And fear about what happens next, because she's 11 years old and she just became famous for something adults shouldn't have to do, let alone children. The woman from seat 23B visits with her 2 sons, the boys from the photograph. You saved their mother, she says, crying. They almost lost me today. How do I thank you for that? How do I possibly thank an 11-year-old girl for giving me more years with my children? Maya doesn't know what to say. The woman, her name is Patricia, kneels beside Maya's hospital bed so they're at eye level. My husband died 2 years ago. These boys have already lost their father. If you hadn't been on that plane, if your father hadn't taught you what he did, my sons would be orphans right now. Do you understand that? You gave them their mother back. Patricia is sobbing now, and Maya starts crying too, and they hold each other while Patricia's sons stand awkwardly nearby, not quite understanding why mommy is crying when everyone survived. The media wants her story. News networks call constantly. Magazines want interviews. The military wants to study how her father's training created such unusual capabilities in a child. Aviation organizations want her to speak at conferences. Everyone wants a piece of the 11-year-old girl who saved 156 people from certain death. Captain Chen and co-pilot Martinez visit her the next day, and Chen's eyes are red from crying. "I'm an experienced pilot with 22 years of flight time," he says quietly. "I've trained for every emergency scenario. But when we lost hydraulics, when every procedure failed, I was helpless. I accepted that we were going to crash and there was nothing I could do. And then you walked into that cockpit with knowledge I didn't have, procedures I'd never learned, capabilities that shouldn't exist in someone your age. You did something I couldn't do. You saved all those lives when I had failed to save them. My father taught me," Maya says simply. "He spent 3 years teaching me. I had time with him that gave me these skills. You didn't fail, you just didn't have the training for a scenario that nobody trains for." Sarah Martinez sits on the edge of Maya's hospital bed. "What you did requires hundreds of hours of practice. The precision, the timing, the understanding of how to manipulate an aircraft with no hydraulic authority, that's not something you learn in a few lessons. Your father must have trained you constantly." "Every weekend," Maya says, and now she's crying because remembering those weekends hurts. "Saturday and Sunday mornings, we'd go out to his garage and I'd practice on his simulator. He'd create scenarios, emergency situations, impossible landings. I'd practice until I got them right. He said someday the skills might matter, someday I might need them to help someone. I thought he was just making up reasons to spend time with me. I didn't know he was literally training me to save lives." Over the following days, as her story spreads, Maya begins to understand the full weight of what her father did. He saw his own mortality in a dangerous profession and decided to pass his expertise to the person he loved most. He created capabilities in a child that exceeded what most adult pilots ever learn. He gave her knowledge that could save lives, and then he died before seeing whether that knowledge would ever matter. And now she knows it mattered. It mattered more than she can fully comprehend. 156 people are alive because James Rodriguez spent 3 years teaching emergency procedures to his daughter, because he loved her enough to give her capabilities she might someday need, because he understood that knowledge is the greatest gift a parent can give a child. But that knowledge came with a terrible burden. Maya is 11 years old, and she just experienced the worst thing most pilots ever face, accepting ultimate responsibility for whether people live or die, making split-second decisions under impossible pressure, controlling an aircraft at the edge of what's possible. She has trauma from that experience that will take years to process. She has survivor's guilt even though she saved everyone, wondering if she could have done better, done more, prevented the injuries people suffered. She wakes up screaming from nightmares where she doesn't pull the throttles back in time, where the aircraft breaks apart on impact, where all those people die because she made a tiny mistake. Carmen holds her daughter through those nightmares, understanding that heroism comes with costs that an 11-year-old shouldn't have to pay. Sometimes Maya wakes up crying about the families she saved, overwhelmed by the weight of those lives. Other times she wakes up terrified that she imagined her success, that everyone actually died and this is all a dream. The child psychologist Carmen takes her to explains that Maya is processing trauma that would challenge even experienced pilots, that what she accomplished was extraordinary but the psychological cost is real and will take time to heal. Maya attends therapy twice a week, learning to separate the nightmares from reality, learning to accept that she did everything right even though her mind keeps replaying everything that could have gone wrong. She has the weight of her father's legacy, understanding now why he trained her so thoroughly, what he was preparing her for, what he wanted her to be capable of achieving. That weight is heavy for an 11-year-old to carry. The FAA reviews her case and determines she's too young to be recognized as an official pilot despite clearly having skills that exceed many professionals. The military offers to continue her training, to develop the unusual capabilities her father created into something even more extraordinary. Aviation organizations want to study her, to understand how a child learned procedures that don't exist in conventional training. Everyone wants something from her, but what Maya wants is simpler and impossible. she wants to show her father what she did, wants to tell him that his training saved 156 lives, wants him to know that everything he taught her mattered in ways he might have hoped but couldn't have fully predicted. 6 months later, Maya visits her father's grave for the first time since the crash. She brings printouts of news articles about the emergency landing, brings letters from survivors thanking her, brings a commendation from the FAA recognizing her extraordinary achievement. She arranges them at the base of his headstone, alongside the flowers Carmen brought. "You prepared me for the worst day of my life," she says quietly, kneeling on the grass. "You spent 3 years teaching me skills I didn't know I'd need, giving me knowledge that seemed like just games but turned out to be life-saving capabilities. You died developing procedures to save lives, and then those procedures actually saved 156 lives when I used them. Your work mattered, Dad. Your training mattered. You mattered." She's crying now, years of grief and pride and survivors' trauma and complicated love for a father who gave her both extraordinary gifts and extraordinary burdens. She's 11 years old, almost 12 now, and she understands more about mortality and responsibility and the weight of legacy than most adults ever learn. But she also understands something beautiful, that her father loved her enough to spend hundreds of hours teaching her skills she might never need, that his dedication to her education created capabilities that emerged during crisis to save lives in ways neither of them could have predicted, and that love expressed through training continues working long after death to prevent other deaths, to save other lives, to matter in ways that echo forward through time. She will carry the weight of what she did for the rest of her life, the trauma of that terrible 8 seconds, the responsibility of controlling an aircraft when conventional procedures failed, the burden of being a child who did something most adults never face. But she will also carry forward her father's work, understanding now that what he taught her wasn't just aviation procedures but a philosophy, that knowledge saves lives, that training creates capabilities that can emerge in moments of crisis, that love means preparing the people you care about for challenges you hope they never face but might need to overcome. Maya Rodriguez, 11 years old, saved 156 lives in 8 seconds because her father spent 3 years teaching her how. That gift of knowledge, that expression of love through dedicated training, created a moment of impossible heroism that prevented tragedy and demonstrated that sometimes parents prepare children for extraordinary challenges in ways neither fully understands until crisis demands those preparations. The aircraft rests in a salvage yard now, being analyzed by investigators who marvel at how it stayed intact through an impact that should have torn it apart, how an 11-year-old girl controlled it with such precision in its final seconds, how procedures developed by a deceased test pilot saved 156 lives years after his death. But the real story isn't about the aircraft or even the emergency procedures. The real story is about a father who loved his daughter enough to teach her everything he knew, about a girl who honored that love by using those teachings to save lives when 8 seconds remained before impact, and about how specific love between parent and child, expressed through aviation training, creates extraordinary capabilities that emerge during crisis to prevent tragedy in ways neither could have predicted but both would have treasured. In the years that follow, Maya will continue her education, will eventually become a pilot herself, will work with aviation safety organizations to develop the procedures her father began. She will carry his legacy forward, turning childhood training into adult expertise, honoring his memory by saving more lives through improved emergency protocols. But she will never forget that terrible day when she was 11 years old and had 8 seconds to save 156 people, when her father's love expressed through patient training became the difference between tragedy and survival, when she learned that the greatest gift a parent can give a child is knowledge that might someday prevent death itself.